In today's digital world, the traditional security parameter has vanished. Users, devices, and data is everywhere inside and outside your organization. So how do you protect what matters the most? That's where Zero Trust model comes in. Hello and welcome. My name is Waleed Mehr. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Welcome to the SC-300 video series where security meets strategy. In this session, we dive into Zero Trust model, the gold standard for modern cybersecurity. We'll explore why identity is the new parameter and how understanding identity providers is a key to securing access in a cloud-first world. Whether you're an IT pro, a security enthusiast, or just curious about how Microsoft defends the digital frontier, this is your gateway to mastering identity and access. So let's get started. Zero Trust is built on three foundational principles. Verify explicitly. Now, always authenticate and authorize based on all available data points, such as user identity, location, device health, services or workloads, data classification, and anomalies. Use least privilege access. After verification, access should be granted based on the principle of least privilege. This means receiving only the minimum level of access required to perform tasks, and only as long as necessary. So just enough access and just in time. For example, a user might be given access to a specific resource for a limited period of time. If their work is not completed, they can request an extension or renew their access. This approach helps to reduce risk by ensuring that permissions are tightly controlled and regularly reviewed. Also limiting user access with risk-based adaptive policies and data protection to secure both data and productivity. With assumed breach, Zero Trust framework, we operate under the assumption that a breach is not just possible, but likely. This means we don't fall into the trap of believing our systems are entirely secure. Instead, we proactively plan for a possibility of compromise by segmenting access and encrypting all sessions and leveraging analytics for threat detection and response. We can significantly reduce the impact of any breach that does occur. This approach ensures that even if an attacker gains access, their ability to move laterally or access sensitive data is limited, and threats are identified and addressed swiftly. Now, to implement Zero Trust, some of the few things that you want to pay attention to would be how we can authenticate something and authorize. And this is where we need to start bringing to the conversation of why do we need identity? For something to or someone to prove who they are, and based on that, what level of access they should be provided. Now, talking about authentication, this is how we validate our identity to a service based on the information that's been provided to the identity provider. Now, authentication is me saying who I am and verifying by simply providing some sort of details. Maybe in real world, we provide our IDs, passports, and similar other verifications that we might have. Again, similarly, we'll talk about some methods that we can use on digital world by providing some sort of details. At a very basic, we could be looking at username and password, but we'll get to more details a bit later on. Now, once you have authenticated and you have validated who you are, you move into the next part, which is talking around authorization. Now, depending on the level of access that you need to be provided to be able to do your job, just what we said under Zero Trust, we're looking at least privilege access implemented in your environment. So talking about just enough access at this point, providing people so they can perform the tasks that they need to do as part of their job role. Now, along with that, as an administrator, you are going to be looking at auditing most of the things that are happening in your organization in terms of analyzing data on who's logging in, if that login was successful, if they try to log in at office hours, out of office hours. So you're looking at auditing a lot of different things to understand different patterns, along with if there were any cybersecurity threats to your environment based on your authentication and authorization. For instance, someone accesses a file in one of your environments which they shouldn't have access to. How did they get access, and why were they looking at that file? It's something that you could find out using auditing. Along with all of that, one of the key areas that you want to also look at is administration. For a very long time, for most of the administrators, we were typically referring to 3 A's, which was authentication, authorization, and auditing. However, performing the 4th A, which is the administration, and yet not necessarily highlighting that area. So we want to highlight that area that as part of your setup, you're also going to be administering all of these things. So as a security administrator, you're looking at understanding who needs details added in for their authentication, what level of access they need, do they need a limited time of access to be able to work on certain areas. So just in time, just enough access as part of your plan in your environment. To ensure you can automate some of this process, we will talk about some more details within this course a bit later, talking about entitlement management as to automate this whole process. Now, let's talk about what is an identity provider. Now, for this, let me jump onto a whiteboard and take you through the explanation of an identity provider. Now, traditionally, if you're looking at communication between a client and a server, we've always had, for instance, a client trying to log in or access resources that are placed on some sort of a server to connect and authenticate. Now, this process would typically require the client to be able to send some details to the server. For us, we can go back to the oldest mechanism that we've known of, typically using username and password. And this is where a client would be able to authenticate to the server to be able to work or connect and gain access to the resources that they might have had. However, we want to introduce something different in between that. We are looking at modern day of working with identity providers and talking about how a modern day identity provider can come into this picture and change some of this. And for that, let's talk about creating an identity provider for us to begin with. And this is where we'll start the communication from our client that is going to start looking at talking to the modern day identity provider. Now, typically the client would exist or have some sort of an existence with with your identity provider, and for it to authenticate to the identity provider, it will provide some sort of details. Now, these details could vary, but we could start with the very basics of username and password for today, and we'll build onto this a bit later on. Now, as a result of that, the identity provider can authenticate the user with the details that it has and provide it with some sort of a token. Now, this token is what we could refer as our security tokens or security claims that it would require or to understand who that client is and what level of access they could have. Now, if in this scenario we were to introduce our client trying to log into different services, let's start building in that conversation by simply introducing a server or a service where my client is trying to log into. Now, one of the first things this client is going to do is trying to gain access to that service. Now, if this service has no knowledge about this client, one of the first things that it would like to do is ask the client to authenticate itself, and will ask it to send that information to it. However, with the modern day identity providers, this is something that it can simply take away and suggest, hey, this is not something I'm going to be doing. I have a service that's available to me that's going to provide me some of that access. So it will bounce that to the identity provider that it belongs to. And in this case, the identity provider already understands this client because it's already authenticated their client. It knows who their client is. And based on that, it will be able to generate a token that can be then sent to the server for it to allow this user or this client to authenticate itself. Now, one key thing that I should mention over here is that the server that we are trying to work with must have some sort of trust built with this identity provider and should recognize that identity provider. Now, one of the key areas that you want to understand around that would be, hey, as a server, I've received a token, let's call this T1, from this identity provider. How do I know this was not tampered with or it's not generated by another service and I've been just presented that? And this is where the server, based on the trust that it has built with the identity provider, it can verify that. Or it can look at using the identity provider's public key to match it with the token to see if it works. And if it was generated by the identity provider, hopefully or surely it will start working and would be able to validate that token that was sent out to the server. Now, as a result of this, the server should be able to give access back to or give access to the client and drop in a cookie in here to recognize that this client has already validated themselves. So as and when it continues to connect to the server again or request for more information, it will present that cookie along with it, which in simple terms is a digitally signed cryptographic token that it keeps there to ensure that it is presented by the same client coming to the server based on an authenticated session that they've already started working with. Let's take another example of how an identity provider would work in a scenario. So if we start with a modern day identity provider to work with, and let's introduce a user to the scenario. Let's call this user Adele over star user, and Adele is going to log into a browser and as a client try and access a website. Now, as Adele reaches that website or tries to authenticate or log in, the website ideally doesn't have any information about Adele. So it will simply bounce that back to Adele to say, hey, browser Adele, authenticate yourself. And this is something that we will push back to our identity provider. Now, initially, Adele would have logged in to her device or authenticated herself by using username and password or many other methods that could have happened. Again, this is something that is between the device or the user Adele and identity provider as a communication or authentication that they might have carried out already. So Adele is authenticated to the identity provider or is known to the identity provider because it's part of that identity service. So once this website bounces a signal back to the identity provider to say, hey, can you authenticate this user for me? Now, this is where it can generate a token for us to suggest, hey, that's fine. I know this user, Adele, is already authenticated with me. I'm happy to give you a cryptographic, digitally signed document that can verify that I'm happy with you trying to give access to Adele onto the website. Now, again, like we said before, this website should have some sort of a trust built between the website and the identity provider so it knows where it is and what it is. And again, it can use this trust to validate the token, in my case, T1. Or like I said before as well, it can look at the cryptographic key to validate this. Now, let's add more to this. Let's assume Adele is now going into another solution, such as, let's assume we go into a SharePoint site and SharePoint website, SharePoint site online. And in this case, if we start looking at the communication between Adele from the browser on Adele's device to log into the SharePoint site, the process is the same. The SharePoint site would be asking Adele, hey, who are you? Confirm your details, and we'll ask you to verify that information, which in turn will go back to the identity provider in this case. The whole process repeats itself again, and the details are sent from identity provider to that service, in this case the SharePoint Online, and it generates another token for it to validate that information around Adele. Now, if you're looking at a correlation between the tokens that the identity provider generates, like stuff T1 and T2, there is none. Each token is generated based on the service that's trying to reach the identity provider, and this can be based on different types of protocols. Most of the modern authentication protocols, like SAML, WS Federation, OpenID Connect. The difference between them probably would be the encoding that they use. For instance, SAML and WS Federation uses XML, and OpenID Connect uses JSON. Now, once this information is provided by the identity provider to the service, typically in the backend or as a result, the service would be able to validate this information or the token that's been generated, given that these services have a trust built by the identity provider, and it will start giving access back to the user to be able to work. In most cases, like I said before as well, they'll drop in some sort of a cookie to recognize that this is the user or the service that authenticated itself and has been granted access. So again, it's not something that another service can take and replay back onto the service. So it generates some sort of information. Let's call this as a C2 token as a authenticated token or cookie that the SharePoint Online drops into my browser. Now, for the previous conversation, we spoke about the website trying to log in. Let's call that as a C1, as a cookie that it drops. Again, the similarities between the two, or the links between the two, none, just based on an authentication process that's completed by that service or an app or a website as part of that. In this scenario, one thing that's very interesting to see that Adele doesn't have to authenticate herself again and again for multiple services that Adele is logging into. This is where the identity provider is taking care of the authentication for her. And this is one of the key features that you could look at within your modern day identity providers, which we'll refer to as single sign-on. Where the user doesn't have to sign in again and again or provide their username and password again and again to authenticate and work. All right, let's start talking about a modern identity provider. And in this scenario, we'll look at Entra ID to understand how Microsoft Entra ID works and what we can do with it as an identity provider. Now, one of the first things that I want to start with our conversation is how does one get access to Entra ID and how can I configure it? A few simple steps to bear in mind. As our star administrator, Adele, is trying to configure this for her company, let's assume. So what Adele would need to do is simply go into one of the portals, either portal.azure.com or M365 portal, to simply register the organization that Adele worked for. So let's assume Adele worked for a company called Contoso, and Adele is going to go register details around that by logging into one of the portals for one of the cloud services that Microsoft offers. And it could be Entra, could be directly Azure or M365. Now, as Adele goes to register, Adele will be providing some details such as the company name as part of the setup, obviously along with her personal details, contact details or address details as part of that setup. And finally, there will be other details that you might need to choose or add. Things like choosing a primary domain that you are going to work with as part of your setup in your environment. Now, this is an important part because most of the details or settings around your organization will be referred to this primary domain that's being set up in your environment. Now, this primary domain by default will be a name of your choice, given that is available to pick from. For instance, I would like to go for Contoso to be my primary domain. If Adele belonged to Contoso, that would be ideal to pick from. There is a possibility that someone else in the world, across the world, might have a similar name that they use. And if that's the case, then you might have to come up with a slightly different name for your primary domain. And what the result of this would be is that it always will have on Microsoft.com as the ending on your primary domain. Now, this is a default setup that you get given as part of you registering yourself into the cloud. Now, all of this in terms of you configuring your environment is what we refer as creating a tenant in your environment. So you as Adele, or in this scenario, Adele is simply going into configuring a tenant for her organization, Contoso, and as part of that, providing some details to configure this in the environment. Now, a few other details we can add very briefly to this as a result of just configuring this and completing this form for the registration. Adele gets access to Microsoft Entra ID as a service that's already running and good to go for her to start working with. And as part of that, Adele becomes the first user on that setup as part of that environment. And this also gives Adele a benefit of being assigned the highest level of access in this environment, giving Adele a role of something called global admin or global administrator in this environment. So Adele has the highest level of access to be able to configure anything that Adele needs in that environment. Now, as a default setup, let's have a quick conversation on some of the on the slide around some of the topics that we've just spoken about. So if we have a look at some of the details, we mentioned earlier on the terminology of what a tenant is. Nothing more than simply representing your organization details in the cloud and you creating details. Like I said, adding my Contoso site to my environment would be my tenant that I'm looking to work with. Now, along within that, Adele, like I said, as the very, very first user, started creating some details about the organization, would get or become the very, very first user on that environment. And in this case, to understand, a user is nothing more than an account that's associated to a person, and simply an identity that our Entra ID uses to recognize or identify different resources. It uses that to identify a person, and we refer to that as a user account. Now, there are a couple of other definitions on the screen, things like identity, nothing more than a resource that identifies you in one way or the other. We'll talk about different methods that we can assign to resources so they can be then validated based on those details. And this could be assigned to a user, to a service, and devices as well. So we'll talk about some more details around that. Once associated to a user or a resource, it becomes an account which has associated data or related data to it. In this case, we'll talk about user accounts in a bit more detail a little bit later. Finally, there's one more item that's listed on the screen called subscription. And this entire scenario for Adele to be able to go and manage account details of the company, Adele doesn't need a subscription to work with directly. However, if Adele is planning to be able to create things in the cloud, in Azure, to be able to work with things, Adele needs at least a subscription to work with, so Adele can start creating these resources. Without a subscription, you're not going to be able to create or manage your cloud resources. So a minimum of one subscription, many others can be added into your environment based on your needs, and that's something that you would need to be able to manage your Azure-based resources that you will have. Directly in Entra under your tenant, these can be managed as a resource for the tenant. However, without subscription, you're still able to complete your Entra ID setup. That wraps up our dive into Zero Trust, why identity matters, and what an identity provider really is. These concepts are the backbone of modern security, and mastering them puts you ahead in the world of identity and access management. This concludes our session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.